Hey everybody, here we are with the first Unit 5 review for this week. Here we're going to be looking at, throughout this unit, the geographical space and context of the world. Today we're looking at the basics, political entities, and structures. Let's get started. Now this is the world as we know it today. We have all these separate countries. We can see all these borders and boundaries within continents, separating spaces from each other politically, legally, in terms of laws and human made structures and phenomena. But the fact of the matter is that we didn't start out this way, right? Of course, thinking back to your other or older history classes, sixth period world cultures, you learned about early civilizations and things like that, and they certainly did not have the same borders and boundaries that we see today in 2020. We started off very early with civilizations, um, like the river valley civilizations, where we saw a lot of coincidence with the start of the first agricultural revolution, the start of the first cities, the start of the first civilizations, period. But these groupings and these entities didn't have the same structures. We don't have some distinct border drawn on a map or drawn in a particular area to discriminate between each empire and the next. That wasn't the case. There was still a sense of territory, but it wasn't to the extent that we have it now, in terms of an actual political boundary on a map separating it from other political boundaries or other political entities, rather. Over time, these empires expand and we see new empires form and change. But again, we're still not at a point where we have these distinct boundaries of where an empire starts and where an empire ends, where the legality of that ends. Because for a lot of these empires, expansion was key, expanding to other ends of the earth in some cases, or at the very least dominating the region in which they were. And that meant that you didn't want to set any set political boundaries because that meant that, well, my empire stops here. And in a lot of cases, they didn't want their empire to stop anywhere. Of course, we see this in South America as well, with Latin American civilizations. But all of this comes down to this idea of territoriality, this idea of trying to control or establish control or express your power through control over space, over just areas of the earth. And that's, a kind of common notion. Or those of you with siblings who maybe have shared a room in the past or have, just had siblings had to share a space in the past, likely can think back on a time where you were arguing or at the very least not agreeing on how to divide the space in which you were. And that territoriality is part of that, right? It's kind of a not quite primal, but almost ingrained instinct, right? If I control more space, I have more control, period. That means I have more power. And for a lot of these empires, and as we'll soon see, colonial powers, that was very much the case, right? Controlling larger amounts of areas, especially if you were a small space to begin with, right? If your country or your region or whatever area you controlled first was very small in comparison, that just meant that your power was so much greater because you were this itty bitty region or empire, but you were controlling so much more space, this territoriality background. Now, we see this with colonization, of course, and we see this in North America, Latin America, where we start to see more of these trends in colonial control. Now, these borders and boundaries certainly had influence, right, as we had colonization come into the West, into the Western Hemisphere, into the further edges of the Western Hemisphere, into the North and South American continents. And we see influences thereof, right, because we see influence of Spanish culture in most of Latin America and parts of the United States. And then we see influences of Portuguese culture in Brazil, and then a mix of French and English culture in the northernmost parts of North America, in what would become the United States and what would become the state of Canada. Now, compared to the past, we now have this new set of countries that are established. But here, when we're looking at these territories, again, this isn't so much a country, and it isn't a country as we would normally think about it today, or state as we would normally call it today in human geography. This was just kind of the established or estimated territory of this particular colonial power, whichever one we're looking at. And that's very different than these explicit boundaries that we have today in the 21st century. We see this in Asia as well, and we see again more colonial powers, excuse me, expanding into the east in this case. But again, no countries as we know them, but lots of territoriality that's going on, right? Controlling space. And as you've learned in eighth grade US history and parts of human geography, um, colonial powers sought to establish control over as much space as possible. Now, if we think about the British Empire, for example, a very small space in the world, right? And we'll go back to this world map just to, a little too far to get that again, right? Because here is our world map, and right here is what was, the British Empire, the origin spot, right here now at the heart of the United Kingdom in England. And this space is relatively small, even compared to any of these other countries that are here, right? The country boundaries we have today, Russia's the largest by far. Um, and then we have other countries like China, countries like Australia, Brazil, the US, and Canada, even, who are also large in comparison. But the United Kingdom, what was then England, Britain, is not very large at all, right? It's this one island. But if we look to the actual control that it established, that one island controlled upwards of 20% of the entire world's land area at its peak in 1914, just at this tail end in the middle of World War One. That's insane, right? This one tiny island that's taking control of over a fifth of the world's landmass, a fifth of the world. It's crazy. But that was the push. That was the territoriality behind a lot of these controls. In addition to other economic factors in terms of the 3Gs, God, glory, gold, and sort of social economic missions. But a lot of that was presupposed to happen after the territorial control occurred. And for the British, and like we looked at in the last unit, 2 units ago actually, in the culture unit, in those culture review videos, language like English spread through colonial influence in a lot of cases. And it makes sense that English becomes this lingua franca because even though we have, let's say, billions of speakers of Mandarin Chinese in China, and that language is spreading throughout the world, the British just had the better, setup because they controlled a fifth of the world's landmass at one point. And that meant that a fifth of the world was exposed directly to British or English speaking culture. And that has a lot to do with diffusion. Right? Now, there are some definitions we go through because all of this changed, right? As we're entering and exiting the right here at this peak, right? That's why we stop in 1914. We see a change in the notion of what it means to have control. And this new idea of what we call a nation state starts to come about, right? Where maybe the best way to control and have influence is not to control every single space, but to have this sort of indirect control of other places outside of your particular area or land region, but have immediate and direct control over your initial space. So we get this idea of a nation state. Now, nations and states, there are 3 definitions you really need to know. A nation itself, again, is a population with a single culture. So the nation of Islam, the nation of Hispanic speakers, Hispanics, the nature of the nation, the nation of French Canadian speakers. Right? These are all people who have generally some sort of common thread in their ancestry or in their histories. And lots of times it has to do with their culture or their ethnicity, their ethnic group. Not always. We can look at Judaism as one example where there's kind of multifaceted connections there because there's connection through the religion itself. But then we also have separate groupings of, let's say, Sephardic or Ashkenazi Jewish descent. And there's variations in between. But generally, when we think of a nation, we're thinking of a population with a single majority culture, where most of that group has the same or similar cultural identity. A state, on the other hand, has to do with government power and specific government power. In this case, we're looking at a population with a sovereign government. Sovereignty here being this ability to have independent control, free from outside influence over your affairs. So you, once you go off to college and afterward, you have your own job, you will have sovereignty over yourself and your space. You'll be able to make decisions for you. Right? You want to go to the grocery store at 10 a.m. and get some Lucky Charms, you can go to the grocery store and get some Lucky Charms. You are sovereign. You do what is best for you. States are like that too. They want to have that independent control, free from outside influence as much as possible. So having that sovereignty is part of these conditions for being a state in order to have that one set area, all right, in this defined territory where you have that control. And today, when we think about countries and as we look through these review videos, really what I'm going to be talking about are states. And that's how I'm going to refer to these quote unquote countries that we come to know. And a lot of you have already been exposed to this because we went through Unit 5 in your classes, or in my class. If you're in my class, state is how we talk about things. Now, to get a nation state, we just put these two together and we get a population with a single majority culture under a sovereign government that is our nation state. Some good examples therein are going to be places like Japan, places like Iceland, who in general we're thinking of islands too. It's not always the case, but the single solitary islands like Japan and like Iceland were just separated for so long from other places that their culture develops idiosynchronistically. So they develop a very unique culture unto themselves, and that cultural identity, that ethnicity also develops unto itself, free from a lot of outside influence until we get more advents of exploration and boat travel and things like that. Now, out of these definitions, we have a bunch of other concepts and categories that come out, like multinational states. We're just adding multi, so a nation is a single culture for a population, that common culture that population shares. Multinational states have their sovereign government. They're a single political entity with a sovereign government, but they have multiple cultures within those boundaries. The United States is a good example of this. As you've seen, we have lots of ethnic identities within the US and lots of ancestries and histories within the United States. And that's what helps qualify the US as a multinational state. Other examples would be Russia, the largest multinational state, Brazil, Mexico, Canada. Majority of states really we're looking at are going to have some degree of multinationality. And typically we're looking at larger areas, but it's not always the case. The larger areas just have more opportunity to be inclusive of other cultures because you just have more land area to support larger populations. Larger populations means you get more variety of people, right? It's not always the case, but we usually see it that way. We can also have what we call multi-state nations. So in the multinational state, before, we're looking at multiple nationalities, multiple nations rather, in the same political entity within one single sovereign state. In multi-state nations, a little different is now we're looking at multiple states, so multiple sovereign governments that contain a single dispersed nation. So North and South Korea are one of these examples, who were split after the Korean War as a result of subsequently to mitigate some of the effects and issues within the Korean War. But that history, historic and ancestry is shared between the two groups from North and South Korea, even if they've kind of diverged now into the modern day since the Korean War. Historically, the two people are still connected. So this is one single nation of people, the Korean people, who are split amongst two states, North and South. We can also have nations that don't have a state at all, right? So lots of states are wanting to have their sovereignty, again, because you want control over your affairs, you want that independence over your affairs. But we have some nations who have a shared cultural identity, but don't have sovereignty in any capacity. The Kurds are one of these groups. So the Kurds, you may have heard on the news, they're a group from Southwest Asia with histories in Syria, Iran, and Turkey. And they have no say in governments for the most part. They had once a semi-autonomous region in Syria that is no more. After the Syrian Civil War broke out, right, things get more complicated with government and smaller groups. But the Kurds are seeking some sort of sovereignty, right, to establish their own space because they don't feel that they have that representation, and they don't have that representation in any of the governments. In whose land areas they currently reside, because they're all spread out between all of these different states here in the Middle East. And So they're one example of a stateless nation, where they have a single common cultural identity, but they don't have their own single independent sovereign state in any capacity in this case. And we also have things like autonomous regions, which are usually tied to a specific culture, excuse me, and have been developed for different reasons. Uh, in in Scandinavia, we have these islands off the coast of Finland. So they are autonomous unto themselves. They're still under the umbrella of Finland, but for the most part, they can develop their own laws and policies for themselves. They're just not quite a separate entity, right? They're not going to be kind of, oh, the island islands are another state. It's not going to quite fit into that category. They're still going to fit under Finland's territory and overall Finland's sovereignty. But all things considered, they have most independent control over their affairs. And usually we're thinking of this when we have a very distinct cultural identity within a country, what we might call an enclave, right? This kind of a separation of a cultural or national identity within another state. In this case, it just happened to coincide with these islands that are off the coast of Finland. Instead of giving up those islands because they are very small, right? So they'd be a microstate even if they were going to be considered a full state on their own. They've been fit under this umbrella for Finland and called an autonomous region instead, still having a large degree of sovereignty, even if they're not completely separate from another state. In the US is more contentious. We have American Indian reservations that were established after and over the years in the 1800s. And in a lot of cases, excuse me again, we have some degree of sovereignty, where for the most part on these reservations, the only government allowed to intervene and without question be admitted onto these spaces is the federal government of the United States. So they're still considered under the umbrella, and they are within the physical U.S., the continental U.S., as we would call it right now. But they, for the most part, are going to enjoy some degree of sovereignty, going to utilize some degree of sovereignty over their affairs, creating laws for public education, for schooling. And again, this is an attempted correction at a history of violence and marginalization by the U.S. government for American Indians and Alaska Natives. Whether that's been fully accepted is definitely a debate that's been happening the last hundreds of years, right, since the reservations were first put into effect. And that's a separate issue, but we can see these autonomous regions as semi-sovereign, or at the least enjoying most sovereignty outside of direct national control or intervention. But for the most part, the federal governments and the national governments in each of these areas aren't going to intervene in many cases. Now, we have all these different regions, and we've now developed into this state-based culture, political culture and climate at least. And so we've seen the development of states. This again after this World War I, because we still see the last falls of empires and we see the establishment of individual countries and states as we know them today. World War I is one of these areas for change, where you see the German Empire transform into the state of Germany, right after this First World War, where prior we had the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who were at war, and after the war ends, we see a division of these large areas into specific countries and states, right? That's a big change that happens. After the fighting ends and after the war ends, we see now both empires divide themselves. The German Empire splits off and becomes the state of Germany, with Poland being established as a result as well. The Austro-Hungarian Empire splits into many different countries to represent many different cultures who were present in the empire, such as Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, which later on splits into another two steps, what we once called the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and which now is Czechia and Slovakia. And Yugoslavia, which is also no more after 1990. As of 1990, that splits into these multitudes of countries, Romania and Bulgaria, which also formed their own independent areas eventually for Bulgaria and Romania after this World War. But this is some of the changes that are happening to the map, right? We have these empires like we did prior, like we looked at with the old river valley civilizations, where you're not wanting to establish a single boundary or say like this is where my empire ends because then that's where your empire ends. And a lot of these empires didn't want to have restrictions on their territorial expansion, their territoriality backed expansion. After World War II, we see some changes too, but especially in regard to this kind of post uh, Western Hemisphere colonization, right? Because after we see colonization end in the 1800s in Latin America and in North America, for the most part, we see a transition at the end of the 1800s, or the Berlin Conference, where we see colonial rule established in Africa and in Asia. All right, this conference of Berlin, we see this next wave of European colonization where they take over areas and they establish control in areas in Africa and in parts of Asia, especially the British and the French in Asia, and then multitude of European powers in Africa, which lasts until the mid 1960s, right? So I've talked about this in class with my students, and those of you who are watching, where we're just thinking about timelines, right? Countries like the US, we're thinking about MDCs versus LDCs, and we've talked about the trends and the patterns where Africa tends to have and does have the highest number of LDCs uh, out of any other continent. A lot of that just has to do with the timing, right? The United Kingdom, what became the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Germany, Italy, all these places just had more time as independent areas and independent spaces and became countries, states, what have you, sooner than lots of other countries. All right, the U.S. If we're thinking about official status, we're looking at like 1789, right, with the Constitution, because Articles of Confederation didn't quite work out, and then we're thinking all the way up till now, right, to 2020. Here, we definitely don't have that timeline, right? 100+ years of development that the U.S. had an advantage over lots of countries in Africa, lots of states in Africa today, because some of these didn't become fully independent until the 1960s. And that's only 60 years now of independence. And that's still a lot of time missing between countries in Africa and countries in other places who we generally consider to be MDCs. We see India become free British control, and that has other implications in the region because we have this partition of India into India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and that leads to other issues in the north of India, in Kashmir and Pakistan, with Kashmir and Pakistan, between this kind of Muslim north in Pakistan and wanting to join or separate from the Hindu majority country, and there's a lot of other issues that happen here. All right, well, we'll talk about that in the next video about exactly why these boundaries and issues happened. These boundary issues happened. We see African colonies become independent states, the decolonization of Africa, as we would call it, or the separation. And we had these countries go into Africa in the first place, mainly looking for natural resources. Industrialization is still taking place in the late 1800s, but you need cheaper resources to keep that stuff going. Especially in terms of manufacturing. So you see countries in Europe and other countries um, in other continents in the West and in the East looking to areas like Africa, which was largely untapped, excuse me, which is largely untapped, save for the slave trade that happened, 200-300 years prior. We see this general cycle that happens of this colonization piece, of initial colonization, decolonization, where we slowly see colonial rule remove itself, and then independence afterward, the becoming of an independent state once colonial rule has gone out, and that sovereignty is established for the people who live in these spaces, by the people who live in these spaces. Into the end of the 20th century, more close to where we are now, we have the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and after the Soviet Union breaks up again in the 1990s, early 1990s, we see a number of states established. Right? What once was the Soviet Union area breaks up into these what become shatter belts, as we call them. We call these shatter belts, these areas of where we see cultural political conflict takes place. Because even though we have this Cold War, we still have these issues that play out throughout the rest of the 1990s. And we think of that in Yugoslavia, especially as an example, at least that I've covered in my class. But we see these areas that were part of this larger conflict zone, and which as a result become a barrier or a bridge between one side of the conflict and the other side. In this case, the East and the West, right, or Eastern Europe, what would become Russia, and Western Europe, what becomes the West. All of these changes take place, and we end up where we started, this video at least, all right, with the states and political boundaries that we have today in the world. All of these countries looking to establish that degree of sovereignty to be free of any sort of direct outside control, and also to have a space where they can best establish laws and policies for themselves and for their citizens. Sometimes that means being in a multinational state and having to accommodate that, like in the US, as best they can, as much as they can, or in Brazil, or in Canada, or in Russia. Sometimes that means working with a unique culture unto itself, like Japan, or Iceland, or the Koreas, which have this kind of nation state identity. Sometimes it's about focusing on oneself and having that independent control to develop as needed because they were under colonial rule for so long, or because they were exploited for so long, like countries in Africa by the Europeans and by other countries now. We see lots of expansion from China. China has expanded a lot into Latin America, lots of investment that's happened there, and lots of investment that's happening now in Africa too. Right? And so we don't see, although we have this independence and the sovereignty, we see other processes start to take place because there's still this economic drive, right? This drive to be in control. Territoriality isn't the cause anymore. People aren't wanting to control physical space, but they do still want to have some control over what happens in the world. And so we end up with these new trends of control from these former colonial or outside powers. And we'll end the video with that in a few seconds. These governments themselves can divide their power or share it in one national government. All right, so this goes to the government forms of these particular states. Federally, they can share their power, like in Germany. So we can have these federal districts, and you can always tell a federal state because they'll have these district distinctions if you look at a political map of the state itself. And these are all administrative units, as we might call them, political subunits. In the US, we call them quote-unquote states. They might be provinces somewhere else. And there's going to be one national government, right, which controls everything in the space, like the US, with the 3 branches of the federal government. But then we also have shared powers, where each of these subunits has some sort of control. They don't have sovereignty. They're not sovereign areas, but they have some sort of control over their affairs. Maybe schooling, education, healthcare, taxes. They're not going to be completely free to do everything they want to do, which is why they're not sovereign states on their own. But they are sharing that power with the central government. In a lot of cases, we'll see that with multinational states. And you might have more cultural identities shared with a particular area in these types of states than in other states that don't have a federal system. Sometimes it's about distance. And you have a state that's maybe fragmented, that's split into a bunch of pieces, like Indonesia. And you have to share power that way because it's just impossible to have any sort of efficient central government when you don't have a central area, right? When your country's split so far apart. Large states can do this too because of that same distance factor. There's so much space in the country itself that there's no way to have an efficient means of national control. Or at the very least, it's easier to address local issues if the local government has the power to address those issues. You can think of our city ordinances right now, right, having different laws on or policies on going out and wearing face masks and things like that. That's all at the discretion of local governments. And that's part of their federal distribution of powers. Other states will be unitary instead, where they're going to just have that one concentration of power in this one space. And they're only going to have power concentrated just in that one central government or in one geographic location. Usually that's the same. What we mean by that is that we have that one capital area, right? You think back to the Hunger Games, the capital, that was a unitary state, right? The local districts, all right, from 1 to 13, what have you, right, didn't have control over their affairs. It was the capital that was making all the choices. It's a unitary state in that sense. And usually we can see this with smaller states because it's easier to have that control. That capital is going to be more accessible to those people. There are also other issues that can happen with that. that we'll look at in a separate video, not this one. All this said, even though we have this control over the individual spaces now, and these countries can go off and establish their governments as they wish, we mentioned that this control is still extended, right? And we have this control extended in a number of different ways. What we'll look at in the next video will be these forces and factors that can lead to this, and those forces and factors specifically dealing with the boundaries themselves. Here's hoping this was helpful to you. As always, hoping you're happy, healthy, and safe. And we'll see you on the next video.